March 9th, 1862. The morning fog over Hampton Roads hung thick as smoke from the dead. Out beyond the shattered hulks of the Union frigates Cumberland and Congress, a strange low silhouette slid across the water, flat, round, and nearly invisible, but for the wisp of steam curling from her stack. Sailors on the gunboats rubbed their eyes in disbelief. She looked nothing like a ship. No masts, no sails, no broad wooden hull. Just a floating slab of black iron, moving with mechanical indifference toward the monster that had destroyed their fleet the day before. The day prior, the Confederate Ironclad Virginia, rebuilt from the wreck of the Union's Merrimac, had torn through the blockade like a god of vengeance. Cannonballs bounced off her iron sides. Wooden decks exploded into splinters under her fire. She sank one ship by ramming straight through it, and set another ablaze until it detonated. By dusk, more than 200 Union sailors were dead, and the Virginia had done what the Confederacy's armies never could. It had erased the illusion of Union naval superiority. Now, in the pale light of Sunday morning, the Virginia steamed back into view to finish the job. But something unexpected awaited her. The Union's answer, the USS Monitor, had arrived overnight after a perilous journey down the coast. Barely a foot of her deck sat above the waterline, and at her center turned a single revolving turret, an invention so radical that many in Washington had called it madness. What followed would not be a battle in any traditional sense, but a mechanical duel, the first in human history. The Monitor and Virginia would pound each other for 4 relentless hours, iron hammering against iron, until smoke and steam swallowed the bay. When it was over, neither ship had sunk, but everything else had. That morning, centuries of naval tradition died in Virginia's tidewater. In the span of one weekend, wooden navies, the pride of empires, had become obsolete. The Confederates had meant only to break a blockade. Instead, they had broken the world's navies. From this muddy stretch of water, a new age was born. The age of steel, steam, and unstoppable industry. By the winter of 1861, the Confederacy was running out of everything except desperation. Union warships now lined the southern coast, from Virginia to the Gulf, strangling commerce, cutting off foreign aid, and turning every harbor into a trap. It was called the Anaconda Plan, an unbroken iron ring that tightened with every passing month. Cotton rotted in warehouses, gunpowder grew scarce, and salt, the lifeblood of preservation, became worth its weight in gold. In Richmond, Confederate leaders met daily to discuss what they could no longer deny. Without a navy, the South would slowly suffocate. The idea of building a fleet to challenge the blockade was laughable. The South had no shipyards of scale, no engine foundries, and almost no access to industrial iron. The Union controlled the rivers and the ports that might have built them. But at the burned-out ruins of the Gosport Navy Yard in Norfolk, Virginia, Confederate engineers found something that would change everything. A sunken hulk, charred and forgotten, lying in the shallows. It was the remains of the USS Merrimac, a steam frigate scuttled by retreating Union sailors when the yard fell into Confederate hands. To most, it was scrap. To a few men, it was an opportunity. Among them was Chief Engineer John L. Porter, a practical mind surrounded by dreamers. Porter proposed a plan as audacious as it was simple. Raise the Merrimac, cut away everything above the waterline, and sheath what remained in solid iron. His idea was not new. European navies were experimenting with ironclads, but in the smoke-choked shipyards of Virginia, it sounded like madness. The Confederate Navy, barely months old, had neither the machinery nor the manpower to complete such a feat. Still, desperation tends to silence doubt. The Confederacy authorized construction, and work began under conditions that bordered on primitive. Blacksmiths hammered rails into crude plates. Mechanics scavenged parts from locomotives and farm engines, and enslaved laborers, pressed into service, hauled tons of iron through the humid Virginia heat. There were no proper blueprints, only rough sketches and instinct. Yet the men worked with fanatical resolve. The Virginia, as the resurrected ship would soon be named, began to take form, a monstrous hybrid of old and new, half wooden frigate, half mechanical fortress. Her appearance defied all tradition. Gone were the tall masts, the graceful lines, and the ornamented figureheads that had defined centuries of naval pride. Instead, a long, sloped roof of thick iron rose from her deck like a tombstone, each plate overlapping the next to deflect enemy fire. Beneath that armored shell sat 10 heavy guns and a reinforced prow ending in a cast-iron ram. She was not built to outmaneuver her enemies. She was built to crush them. Every decision in her design spoke to the South's reality. The Confederacy lacked the steelworks to forge armor in sheets, so they melted railroad tracks and church bells. They lacked copper for bolts, so they scavenged house fittings. Even her engines were old, barely functional relics pulled from the Merrimac's wreck. Her draft was so deep that she could hardly navigate the James River without scraping mud. Her crew quarters were stifling, her ventilation poor, and her visibility nearly non-existent. She was, in every sense, an improvised weapon. But to the South, she was hope made metal. Newspapers hailed her as the monster that will sweep the Yankee fleet into the sea. Confederate citizens visited the yard to glimpse the iron beast that might finally break the blockade. The shipwrights, engineers, and sailors who worked on her began to speak of her not as a vessel, but as a deliverance. When the Virginia finally slid into the water on February 17, 1862, she looked more like a floating warehouse than a warship. Her engines groaned, her armor weighed her down so heavily that water lapped within inches of her deck, and her steering was so clumsy that turning required an acre of open water. Yet for all her flaws, she embodied something the Confederacy had lacked since the war began: an equalizer. By early March, word of her completion reached Union blockaders at Hampton Roads. They laughed at first, calling her a floating barn. Then came the reports: thick iron plating, mounted guns, a ram strong enough to pierce a hull. The laughter faded. In Washington, Navy Secretary Gideon Welles received grim warnings from his commanders. If this ironclad proved real, no wooden ship could stand against it. The South, it seemed, had built something that could alter the balance of the war. Inside the Virginia, the crew prepared for their first mission. Captain Franklin Buchanan, a stern, gray-haired veteran of the Old Navy, gathered his men and told them plainly, "Tomorrow, gentlemen, we shall make history." No one argued. The ship's guns were loaded, the boilers primed, and the black smoke of her furnaces began to drift into the night. When dawn broke over Hampton Roads on March 8, 1862, the Confederate gamble was ready to be tested. The Virginia creaked forward under the weight of her own armor, steam hissing from her pipes, like breath from a sleeping giant. On the horizon waited the Union blockade, a wall of wood and canvas that had choked the South for nearly a year. As the ironclad moved toward it, the world of naval warfare, 3 centuries old, was about to burn to the waterline. When word of the Confederate Iron Monster reached Washington in the autumn of 1861, it struck the Navy Department like a thunderclap. Rumors told of a ship built from the burned hulk of the Merrimac, plated in railroad iron and armed with guns heavy enough to sink a frigate in a single volley. Reports were fragmentary, but the fear was real. If such a vessel sailed into Hampton Roads, it could destroy the blockade, bombard northern ports, and tilt the war's balance overnight. The Union Navy, one of the largest wooden fleets in the world, suddenly looked as vulnerable as a barn in a lightning storm. Gideon Welles, the bearded and stubborn Secretary of the Navy, moved fast. He called for designs for a new kind of warship, a vessel to meet and destroy any ironclad the enemy may build. 3 proposals emerged from the competition, but one stood out for its sheer audacity. A floating gun platform with no masts, almost no deck, and a single revolving turret of solid iron. The design came from a Swedish-born engineer named John Ericsson, a man both brilliant and controversial. His reputation had been scarred years earlier when a faulty cannon of his design exploded, killing several men, and the Navy had sworn never to deal with him again. Now, with the blockade's fate hanging in the balance, they had no choice. Ericsson's concept looked insane on paper. The ship's hull would sit almost entirely underwater, exposing only an iron deck 18 inches above the waves. At its center, a cylindrical turret 20 feet in diameter would rotate by steam power, allowing 2 massive 11-inch Dahlgren guns to aim in any direction. She would rely entirely on machinery, no sails, no backup propulsion. Critics called it a cheese box on a raft. Ericsson called it the future. Construction began at the Continental Iron Works in Brooklyn on October 25, 1861, and what followed was one of the most remarkable industrial efforts in American history. The Union government demanded completion within 100 days, a schedule so absurd that shipbuilders laughed when they read it. Yet Ericsson accepted, promising delivery on time or forfeiture of payment. In an age when even a small gunboat could take a year to build, his commitment bordered on lunacy. What made it possible was not magic, but machinery. Northern industry, raw, organized, and relentless, roared to life behind the project. Iron plate from Troy, New York, boilers from Manhattan, rivets and bolts from New Jersey, engines from Brooklyn, all rushed by rail and river to the East River shipyard. More than 40 companies contributed parts, a logistical ballet that only an industrialized nation could perform. Workers toiled through snowstorms under torchlight, hammering and riveting without pause. The sound of their work, the rhythmic clang of iron, the hiss of steam, was the anthem of a nation reinventing war. As the ship took shape, her scale stunned even her builders. The armor on her deck was 5 inches thick. Her engines weighed 40 tons each. Her turret alone contained 8 layers of 1-inch iron plate bolted together, forming a cylinder that could shrug off a cannonball. She was only 172 feet long and 42 feet wide, smaller than most frigates, but every inch was devoted to survival and firepower. There were no crew quarters worth speaking of. Men slept beside boilers and pumps, and the air below decks grew stifling from heat and smoke. But speed and comfort were irrelevant. The Monitor was not built to sail oceans. She was built to kill iron. By February 1862, she was ready for sea trials. Ericsson watched from the pier as his mechanical child slid into the East River, steam hissing from her valves, her black iron skin gleaming with condensation. She floated lower than anyone expected, her deck barely visible above the waterline. Critics muttered that she would sink in the first storm. Ericsson didn't answer. He simply pointed south, to Hampton Roads, where the Virginia was rumored to be nearly complete. Time was running out. On March 6th, the Monitor set out under the command of Lieutenant John Worden, bound for battle. The voyage nearly killed her. Heavy seas off Cape Hatteras flooded her ventilators, filled her engines with salt water, and left the crew fighting for their lives. Worden ordered men to plug leaks with oakum and blankets, while others worked the pumps for 24 hours straight. She limped onward, every joint groaning, her iron deck awash. At last, late on the night of March 8th, the Monitor entered Hampton Roads. Smoke from the burning Congress lit the horizon, proof that the Virginia had already struck. The crew could see the orange glow from miles away and the faint thunder of cannon fire echoing across the bay. They knew they were too late to save the ships that had burned. But they also knew what waited at dawn. The Monitor, this strange mechanical raft, conceived in panic and built in haste, had arrived at the edge of history. Beneath her iron skin pulsed the industrial power of the Union, a nation whose factories could outproduce any empire on earth. She was not graceful. She was not beautiful. But she was something far more dangerous. The first weapon of the machine age, forged in 100 days to meet a Confederate nightmare with the cold precision of steel and steam. The morning of March 8, 1862, broke clear and still over Hampton Roads. On the Union side, sailors aboard the wooden warships Cumberland, Congress, and Minnesota went about their routines, unaware that the age of sail had just entered its final day. From the south, down the Elizabeth River, came a trail of black smoke unlike any seen before, thick, oily, and low to the water. As the strange shape beneath it drew nearer, the men on deck began to whisper. It was no frigate, no sloop, no vessel they could recognize. It was a dark, sloped form, armored and angular, crawling forward with grim inevitability. The Confederate Ironclad Virginia had come to war. Her commander, Captain Franklin Buchanan, stood atop her casemate, his white beard streaked with soot, barking orders through the din of clanging machinery. Inside, the air was suffocating. The temperature near the boilers exceeded 120 degrees, the smell of burnt grease and iron filling every lungful. Coal dust stuck to the sailor's skin like ash. The Virginia was less a ship than a furnace, slow, deafening, and unstoppable. When her crew loaded the first broadside, 2 7-inch Brook rifles, they could hear the enemy's drums echoing across the bay. At 2:00 p.m., Buchanan gave the order to fire. The first shell from the Virginia struck the Cumberland at close range, punching through her side as if through paper. Union gunners answered with a full volley, but the cannonballs simply bounced off the iron hull, skipping harmlessly into the sea. The crew of the Cumberland watched in disbelief as their best shot, an 80-pound solid shot fired at point-blank range, shattered into fragments against the Confederate armor. Then came the moment that changed naval warfare forever. The Virginia turned deliberately, aligned her bow, and rammed the Cumberland just below the waterline. The sound was like a collision of mountains. Iron met oak, and oak lost. The Cumberland heeled over, water flooding her gun deck. Yet even as she sank, her gunners refused to stop. They kept firing until the waves closed over the muzzles of their guns, dragging 121 men down with her. Next came the Congress. She tried to flee, but the Virginia's shells caught her broadside. Hot iron tore through her decks, igniting powder charges, sending men and timbers flying. Fire spread rapidly, trapping sailors below decks. White flags appeared along her rail. The Confederates ceased fire long enough for the surviving crew to abandon ship, then resumed bombardment when Union shore batteries continued shooting. The Congress burned through the night, her masts collapsing in sheets of flame before her magazine exploded just after midnight, lighting the sky like a second sun. From the Union shore batteries and the stranded Minnesota came frantic signals to Washington. Telegraphs clattered with disbelief. The Merrimac is destroying the fleet. Cannon useless. Armor impenetrable. Officers ashore watched through telescopes as cannonballs bounced off the Virginia's sides like marbles on stone. Some described her as a submerged volcano. Others thought she looked like a roofed house adrift. None could comprehend what they were seeing. A single ship rendering a navy obsolete in an afternoon. By dusk, the Virginia had achieved what no Confederate army had yet managed: total domination of a battlefield. 2 Union ships destroyed, 1 crippled, hundreds dead, and the blockade itself hanging by a thread. Yet her own crew paid a price. Smoke filled every compartment. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion, and several guns jammed under the strain. Buchanan himself was wounded when a rifle ball struck his thigh while directing fire from the deck. The ship was battered, her smokestack riddled with holes, her iron plates dented and warped. But she had proven the unthinkable. An ironclad could annihilate an entire wooden fleet. As the Virginia limped back to Norfolk for repairs, Confederate soldiers on the shoreline erupted in cheers. Civilians rushed to telegraph offices to send triumphant reports to Richmond. Newspapers would soon call it the day wooden navies died. In Washington, the mood was panic. The Secretary of War feared the Virginia might steam up the Potomac and shell the Capitol. Ship captains spoke in hushed voices about abandoning the blockade entirely. What no one yet realized, neither the jubilant South nor the stunned North, was that the Virginia's reign would last less than 24 hours. That night, as her crew slept beside their guns, a small, unfamiliar silhouette slipped into Hampton Roads under cover of darkness. She was squat and circular, with a single turret turning slowly in the moonlight. To the exhausted men aboard the Virginia, she looked like a barge. To history, she looked like the future. The Monitor had arrived. Dawn came thin and gray over Hampton Roads. Smoke from the burning Congress still drifted across the water, carrying the stench of charred timber and gunpowder. The Confederate ironclad Virginia lay anchored near Sewell's Point, her crew exhausted from the previous day's destruction. They expected to finish their work that morning, to destroy the grounded Minnesota, scatter the Union blockade, and turn the tide of the war. Captain Catesby Jones, now commanding after Buchanan's wounding, gave the order to raise steam. The Virginia creaked forward, her furnaces glowing red, and her guns loaded for another massacre. But as she neared the smoldering wrecks of the Cumberland and Congress, the Confederate lookouts spotted something small and strange guarding the Minnesota. It was not a frigate, nor a sloop, nor any vessel they recognized. It sat low in the water, barely visible above the waves, an iron cylinder with a single rotating turret glinting in the pale sun. A few men laughed at first. "A Yankee raft," one muttered. But within minutes, the laughter stopped. The raft was moving toward them, fast. The USS Monitor had arrived. Her commander, Lieutenant John Worden, stood at the open hatch, spyglass in hand. His crew, fewer than 50 men, were cramped inside a space the size of a railroad car. The air was thick with steam and sweat. Her 2 11-inch Dahlgren guns, massive smoothbores weighing 8 tons each, were the ship's only weapons, yet they were mounted inside a fully rotating iron turret, a design no one had seen in combat before. Worden's orders were simple: protect the Minnesota and stop the Virginia at all costs. The 2 ships closed the distance to within a few hundred yards. At 8:01 a.m., the Monitor fired the first shot. The sound thundered across the bay, followed seconds later by the crash of the Virginia's broadside. Cannonballs screamed through the air, smashing into armor and ricocheting into the sky. Where wood would have splintered, iron simply rang. The battle that followed was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. Inside the Virginia, men loaded and fired in suffocating heat. The air shimmered with smoke. Ears rang from the constant impact of shot on metal. Each strike made the ship shudder like an earthquake. The Monitor circled her opponent, keeping the turret rotating, firing, reloading, firing again. Her compact size and steam-powered agility made her nearly impossible to target. The Virginia's heavier guns struck again and again, but the Union ironclad's armor held firm. The duel devolved into a brutal stalemate. a test of endurance, not accuracy. At one point, the Monitor rammed the Virginia in a desperate attempt to break through her armor. The impact barely dented the Confederate ship, but the shock cracked the Monitor's pilot house, showering Worden with fragments of iron and blinding him temporarily. Dazed and bleeding, he ordered his ship to fall back. Command passed to Lieutenant Samuel Greene, who turned the Monitor for another run. On shore, soldiers and civilians watched in stunned silence. The cannon fire echoed across the harbor, but the usual carnage, splintered decks, collapsing masts, fire, was missing. This was a new kind of battle. No smoke rising from burning wood, no screams of men torn by flying shards. Just the relentless pounding of iron on iron, like blacksmiths forging the future. For nearly 4 hours, the two ships pummeled each other at point-blank range, neither able to inflict serious damage. The Virginia's armor was too thick, her sloped plating deflecting the Monitor's shells. The Monitor, though smaller, was too nimble, and her turret too fast to hit reliably. Inside both vessels, crews fought exhaustion and heat as much as the enemy. Thermometers inside the Monitor's turret reached 150 degrees. Men fainted beside the guns. The smell of oil, metal, and human sweat became unbearable. Finally, around noon, the Virginia's engines began to fail. Her smokestack was shredded, her visibility reduced to almost nothing. Captain Jones, fearing she would run aground at low tide, ordered her to withdraw toward Norfolk. The Monitor, her crew equally spent, and her commander half-blind, did not pursue. The battle was over. On paper, it was a draw. Neither ship had sunk. Neither had surrendered. But in truth, the verdict was already written. The Virginia had proven the futility of wood. The Monitor had proven the supremacy of industry. Together, they had erased centuries of naval tradition in a single morning. As night fell, both ships lay battered but afloat, drifting in the calm waters of Hampton Roads. Telegraphs flashed the news across the country before sunset. The Ironclads have met. Wooden navies are no more. The age of sail, proud and romantic, had been swept aside by the hiss of steam and the clang of iron. From this day forward, the seas belonged not to wind and wood, but to machines. News of the battle traveled faster than the ships themselves. Within days, telegraph lines hummed with reports of the iron monsters that had faced each other in Hampton Roads. Newspapers in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia printed breathless headlines: "A battle without splinters," and "The age of iron begins." To the stunned public, the clash between the Monitor and the Virginia seemed like something out of science fiction, a glimpse of warfare's mechanical future. But beyond the headlines, a far more profound shock rippled outward. Every navy on Earth suddenly realized that the fleets they had spent centuries perfecting were now relics. In Washington, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles read dispatches with both relief and dread. The Monitor had prevented disaster, saving the Union blockade from collapse. But her very success made the Navy's wooden squadrons look obsolete. "The combat of yesterday," one officer wrote, "has revolutionized naval warfare." The United States, barely industrialized before the war, now found itself standing at the threshold of a new era it had not fully prepared for. The Union could outbuild the Confederacy? Yes. But could it outbuild the world? Across the Atlantic, the reaction was even more dramatic. The British Admiralty, masters of the largest wooden navy in existence, received the telegraphed report on March 28th. Admirals who had spent their lives commanding ships of oak and sail gathered in silence as the details were read aloud. One of them reportedly muttered, "We are fools to boast of our wooden walls." At that moment, the Royal Navy, pride of the British Empire, became obsolete without firing a shot. Britain's ironclad HMS Warrior, launched just the year before, had seemed revolutionary, a hybrid of wood and iron with a partial armored belt. But after Hampton Roads, even the Warrior appeared outdated. The full armor of the Monitor and Virginia proved that nothing less than total iron protection could survive modern firepower. Within weeks, the Admiralty issued new orders. All future warships would be armored from keel to deck. Shipyards along the Thames and Clyde shifted overnight, melting down wood and forging iron by the ton. France reacted just as quickly. Emperor Napoleon III's government accelerated production of its own ironclads, beginning with the Gloire, a ship whose design would now need updating before it even touched the water. It's T3. Petersburg, the Russian Navy, still rebuilding after its humiliation in the Crimean War, rushed to develop iron-plated river monitors for the defense of the Baltic. Even Prussia, barely a naval power, began studying turret designs, modeled after the Monitor. Every major power understood the same thing. Hampton Roads had rendered centuries of naval doctrine meaningless. Seamanship, once the mark of empire, was now secondary to metallurgy, steam engineering, and industrial scale. Control of the seas would no longer depend on wind or courage. It would depend on factories. The irony was brutal. The Confederate Virginia, born of desperation, hammered together from railroad scraps and scavenged engines, had unintentionally set the world on fire. Her creators had sought only to defend their coast, to punch a hole in the blockade that was starving the South. Instead, their crude invention forced empires to rebuild their navies from the keel up. The Confederacy could never exploit this revolution. Its foundries were too few, its resources too thin. The industrial giant that would benefit most was the very one it had sought to destroy: the Union. In London and Paris, naval analysts pored over eyewitness accounts of the battle. They noted the incredible durability of both vessels and the absence of traditional naval spectacle. No shattered masts, no blazing rigging, no heroic boarding actions. War at sea, they realized, had lost its romance. A French journalist wrote, "The era of the sailor has ended. The engineer now commands the ocean." The shift was not only technological, but psychological. Generations of officers had been trained to think of the sea as a realm of wind and wood, where courage and cunning determined victory. Now, power resided in blast furnaces and steam turbines. The true battlefield was not the ocean, but the factory floor. By the summer of 1862, the ripple effects were undeniable. New ironclads were being laid down in yards from New York to Glasgow, Cherbourg to St. Petersburg. Nations that had once competed for colonies now raced for iron. The Monitor's revolving turret became the template for the next half-century of naval architecture, from the American dictator to the British devastation. The world's oceans would never again look the same. The wooden fleets that had carried explorers, merchants, and empire builders across the globe for 300 years were suddenly museum pieces in waiting. The battle fought in a muddy Virginia estuary had redrawn the global map, not through conquest, but through invention. The Confederates had sought a weapon to break a blockade. What they created was a revolution that broke an entire age. The Monitor and Virginia would never meet again. Both ships would vanish within the year, claimed not by enemy fire, but by the elements that had once defined their world. In May 1862, with Union forces advancing on Norfolk, the Confederates scuttled the Virginia to prevent her capture. Her crew set her ablaze, watching as the heat warped her iron plates until she cracked apart and slipped beneath the water that had once carried her to glory. 7 months later, in December, the Monitor met her own end off Cape Hatteras, swallowed by a violent storm that her low, flat deck could not withstand. 16 sailors drowned as the iron hull disappeared beneath the Atlantic. Both vessels had lived less than a year, But that single year had been enough to kill every wooden navy on Earth. In the months following Hampton Roads, the lesson of iron became law. The United States Navy, shaken and inspired in equal measure, launched an entire class of monitor-style vessels, 50 in total, built in northern shipyards that now roared day and night with the sound of industrial war. They served on rivers, in harbors, and along coasts, pounding Confederate fortifications with mechanical precision. Each new ship was faster, tougher, more efficient than the last. The Confederacy, unable to match the North's industrial pace, was forced to watch as its innovation became its undoing. What had begun as a Southern gamble now cemented the Union's dominance through steel and steam. Abroad, the transformation was immediate and irreversible. Within 5 years, ironclads replaced the wooden fleets that had ruled the seas since the days of Drake and Nelson. Britain launched the Devastation, the world's first fully armored, turreted battleship, while France followed with the Redoutable, the first major warship built of steel rather than iron. The arms race that began in a muddy Virginian inlet now spanned oceans. By the 1880s, shipyards in Germany, Japan, and Italy were hammering out steel hulls at a pace that would have been unimaginable in 1862. The age of craftsmanship was over. The age of production had begun. The cultural shift was equally profound. Naval heroism had long been measured in skill and seamanship, in the art of tacking into the wind, reading the sky, and firing broadsides by instinct. The ironclad erased all of that. Victory no longer depended on the courage of men aloft in rigging. It depended on engineers, machinists, and factory workers far from the front. The sea, once romantic and alive, became mechanical. "The charm of the sailor's life is gone," lamented one British officer. "We are engineers now." Yet in that transformation lay the blueprint for modern power. The ironclad was not merely a weapon, it was a symbol of the industrial state, the idea that a nation's strength could be forged in foundries rather than fields. In America, this realization extended beyond the war. The very infrastructure that had built the Monitor, ironworks in Troy, foundries in Pittsburgh, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, became the foundation of a post-war manufacturing empire. When the war ended in 1865, the Union emerged not just victorious, but transformed. It had become an industrial nation, ready to project power far beyond its shores. The Confederacy's legacy, meanwhile, was a haunting paradox. Its engineers had pioneered the very technology that sealed their defeat. The Virginia had proven the concept of armored warfare, but the South lacked the factories to replicate it. What began as a weapon of defiance became the instrument that underscored the inevitability of industrial defeat. In trying to save an agrarian world, the Confederates had unleashed the age that would bury it. By the turn of the century, iron had given way to steel, steam to turbines, and guns to long-range artillery. The descendants of the Monitor and Virginia, massive battleships like HMS Dreadnought and the USS Texas, would dominate oceans for the next 100 years. Each carried the bloodline of that first duel in Hampton Roads. Revolving turrets, armored hulls, engines of unstoppable force. Standing on the shores of the James River today, there is little sign of where the world changed. The water is calm, the air quiet. Yet beneath the surface lies the ghost of a revolution. In a single weekend, 2 crude machines, one born of desperation, the other of industrial genius, did what centuries of admirals, explorers, and kings had never managed. They ended an era. The Battle of Hampton Roads was not about who won or lost. It was about what ended. When the smoke cleared on March 9, 1862, the great wooden fleets of history were already ghosts. The oceans no longer belonged to wind and canvas, but to iron and industry. From that day forward, every empire would rise, or sink, on the power of its machines.